Hello and welcome to episode 14 of the Monday Night Review. I'm Corinna Harrod, and this week we're having a little bit of a weirdy cheat episode. We're on the second part of the London Tube A to Z, and I'm doing a twofer by combining Aldgate and Aldgate East. Now, this is partly because they're linked by the myth of a plague pit, which I'm going to get onto later, and partly because this area of London is so tied in with the story of Jack the Ripper that it makes research incredibly difficult. So here we go. Last week I was in the studio in my mum's house. This week I am camping out in my 8-year-old son's bedroom because we've got building work going on outside and I figured it was the quietest place to be. So, Aldgate was one of the gates of the former defensive wall around the City of London and now refers to the area of Aldgate, the High Street, part of the City of London and parts of the London Borough of Tower Hamlets. It's very hard to research anything in this area of London without coming up against pages and pages and pages of stuff on Jack the Ripper, which is fine. It's still possibly the most famous unsolved serial killer of all time, but it makes any paranormal, true crime, or indeed historical research of the area nigh on impossible. Stories of haunted tube stations are not uncommon, and we'll no doubt hear more about them during this series, but Aldgate Station is so haunted that the station allegedly has its own hauntings logbook. I'd love to see that one day. As for Aldgate East, though there is still a station called Aldgate East, it's not the original station. It's in fact 500 foot, or 150 metres, east of where it once stood, and was moved to allow more space for the expansion of the underground tube lines. The original station opened in 1884, 8 years after Aldgate Station, and was nearly called Commercial Road, which I prefer. The new one, which was completely subterranean, was opened in 1938. You can still see parts of the old station if you peer through the dark while you're going down certain parts of the tube line between Aldgate and Aldgate East now. I've never seen it, but I quite fancy a trip over to East London just to have a look, because that sounds kind of creepy. Many believe that Aldgate Tube Station was built on the site of a plague pit, and any reference to the tube station or its hauntings mention this. However, there's no historical accuracy in this, though it is possible that Aldgate and Aldgate East were near a mass burial site, originally in the churchyard of St Butolph's, I'm going to say, which in the 1600s had a much bigger churchyard. While plague pits were mass graves, they were usually, where possible, dug into churchyards, which were much bigger at the time. But there's no record of any bodies being discovered during the digging of the tube lines to those stations, and a lot of the historical information comes from what is actually a work of fiction, written by someone who spoke to a lot of people who were alive at the time of the plague, but it does remain that it is a work of fiction. He published it as a novel, but a lot of people have taken it as historically accurate. And so that's where all of that information comes from. So, in the control room at Aldgate Station, situated in the older part of the station, footsteps have been heard walking over sleepers and stopping where an original door was sighted. Inexplicable whistling is also heard. Apparitions in ragged clothes have been seen standing at the far end of the platform and then fading away. It's also the place where some have claimed to see the legendary Black Train, an old-fashioned 19th century engine with carriages believed to carry souls to the underworld. One man claims that whilst waiting for the last tube, which would be around midnight, he heard the sound of a train in the tunnel. He waited for a train to appear, and when it did, it was unusually black. Tube lines in this country are white with blue and red on them. And the windows were so covered in dirt, he was unable to see in. After stopping for some minutes, the train moved on. There were no other witnesses on the platform at the time, and if this did happen, it could easily have been some kind of weird freight train. So I'm taking that one with a pinch of salt. The most famous occurrence, though, was when some engineers saw the figure of an old woman gently stroking the hair of an elderly colleague. He seemingly felt nothing as he worked, and minutes later made an error which would normally have been fatal. 22,000 volts surged through his body, and though he was knocked unconscious, he suffered no ill effects except for some bruising. Some tellings of the story have the woman stroking his hair as he lay unconscious. Others have it happening before. Others have it that he fell on the tube lines and that's how he got electrocuted, but all believe that this spirit of the tube station is benevolent and saved his life, and there have been multiple witnesses to this, and she's believed that she's been seen since, and sometimes she's referred to as the Angel of Aldgate. I'm sure similar hauntings have been mentioned at Aldgate East Station based on the myth of the plague pit, but whilst I was researching this, I came along a story that I'd never heard of before and was shocked that an event which had such huge historical impact on London could not be more well known. So the main story for this week is a true one from the recent past and something far worse than a near-death experience or a haunting. This event happened near Aldgate East Station in what was formerly called St Mary's Park. So today we're going to talk about the murder of Altab Ali. I would like to not only apologise for my terrible pronunciation of some names, but also quite often, a few times, a racial slur is used in this story, which I don't want to use. It begins with a P, ends in an I, so I'm going to be saying P word instead. So in 1952, the Bengali language movement started in what was then East Bengal, soon to be East Pakistan, and what is now called Bangladesh. At the time, a church in East London that had been bombed during the Second World War was demolished, and the square of the churchyard left derelict. The two would become forever linked by an incredibly tragic murder. The East London Bangladeshi community started as mostly men who'd either stayed after fighting for Britain in the Second World War or were part of the voucher migration scheme and came to work in factories when no living could be made at home. In 1962, the British government passed the first Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which was aimed at limiting the number of migrants into Britain from Commonwealth countries, including India and East and West Pakistan. The Act restricted migration to three categories: people who had a specific job in Britain, people who had special skills or qualifications such as doctors and nurses, other unskilled workers, with priority given to those who'd fought for Britain in World War II. The East End of London was near the docks, and so the community around Brick Lane and Tower Hamlets started there and grew, with many families coming over to join their men and live in extremely difficult circumstances, cramped living conditions, and constant threat of violence and racist attacks. And because I'm British, I have to mention absolutely rubbish weather. London in the mid-70s was a time when racism was scarily acceptable and violence against Black and Asian people escalated, encouraged by the National Front Party. In Tower Hamlets in East London, the Bangladeshi community were being targeted daily. Racism and racists were out and proud, with pubs putting racist posters in the windows saying no blacks, no Irish, no P words, and shops often refusing to serve non-whites. It was unsafe to walk on the streets, and their homes were frequently subjected to bottles, bricks and stones being thrown through the windows, and in some horrifying incidents, petrol poured through the letterbox. Kids had to run home from school to avoid getting hit and had to learn to fight back to survive, but those who fought back risked getting arrested themselves, which would bring a whole host of other problems. Faced with an unwelcoming and dangerous environment, Bangladeshi families usually stayed close to their community. There was safety in numbers, so no one wanted to move boroughs. Indeed, there were other areas that would have made the area around Brick Lane look like a positive safe haven. Moving boroughs only really happened when the targeted violence got so bad, it became a matter of urgency to move. For some, the only option was to leave the country, and therefore the prospect of work, because the situation was getting so dangerous and untenable. The policing for migrant communities was totally non-existent, with many policemen being racist themselves, and others believing the non-British communities were a problem that they didn't have time to solve and wasn't in their remit. At the age of 16, a young man named Altab Ali moved to London from Bangladesh with his uncle. This was in 1969, so technically his homeland was still East Pakistan, but to avoid confusion, I'm just going to consistently refer to it as Bangladesh. Altab Ali went home to Bangladesh in 1975 to get married and then returned to London to continue working so he could send money back to his family. His wife was living with his family back home and would come to join him when he'd saved enough money and established satisfactory living conditions. And this was absolutely standard for a family from Bangladesh at the time. On the 4th of May 1978, Altab Ali was walking home from his work in Brick Lane. Ali stopped to buy some food and spoke to a friend saying he was going to go home, cook supper and then go out to vote in the local elections. It is worth noting that the National Front had 43 councillors in the borough at the time, which is a frighteningly large amount. But Ali never made it home. He was walking through St Mary's Gardens by St Mary's Churchyard near the corner of Adler Street and Whitechapel Road when he was approached and attacked by 3 teenagers with knives. He was brutally stabbed, managing to stagger a few steps before collapsing. Ali was taken to Royal London Hospital where he was declared dead on arrival, his death caused by severe wounds to the neck. He was 25 years old. This attack came only weeks after 10-year-old Kenneth Singh had been beaten and stabbed to death in East London. 17-year-olds Roy Arnold, Carl Ludlow and another boy of 16 were arrested for the killing of Ali. When asked why they'd attacked a young man just walking on his way home, the 16-year-old, who was himself allegedly mixed race, said it was completely random. If you saw a P word, you'd mug them and beat them up. In 1979, it was reported that the 16-year-old, who was never named as he was a juvenile when he was arrested, had been given 7 years in jail for murder, while the 2 older boys just got 3 years each for robbery. Though Altab Ali had not been politically active, he now became a symbol of anti-racism for his community. Ali was a completely normal man like thousands of his neighbours, a layperson working in the rag trade to send money back home to his wife and family in Bangladesh. And it was precisely the normality of his life that made him such a potent symbol for the movement. Ali's murder was not a standalone incident. In East London, Asians were being subjected to vicious attacks on a daily basis. 110 alone between January 1976 and August 1978, and those are just the ones that we know of. However, the killing was the straw that broke the camel's back. The Bangladeshi community organised a massive national demonstration, the biggest gathering of Bangladeshis in the UK since liberation in 1971. 12,000 people took to the streets with men, women and children, joined by members of the Caribbean, Indian and Pakistani communities, as well as anti-racist and anti-Nazi groups from the area. The demonstrators marched behind Ali's coffin, following him from Whitechapel through central London to Hyde Park, where they held a rally, and on the way back they delivered a petition to 10 Downing Street demanding action against racism. The rally was called the Battle of Brick Lane. A one-day community strike followed in July 1978, with around 6,000 Bangladeshi workers taking to the streets. The demonstrations were a success, opening the eyes and ears of national media, the police and politicians. Members of the Bangladeshi community became involved in local politics, tenants' associations, and began to play a leading role in local politics and building the community. The events inspired minority communities in other parts of the country to take a stand, but it would be wrong to imply that things happened overnight. Injustice continues to this day, and violent incidents continued after the death of Ali. At least the politicians and journalists were more aware of the human impact of this violence. In June 1978, just a month after the murder, another Asian man named Ishaq Ali was killed in a racially motivated attack in Hackney. Not long after, the National Front moved its headquarters to Great Eastern Street, a short walk from St Mary's Park. However, the racists were shunned. When National Front skinheads began handing out pamphlets in Bethnal Green, anti-racist campaigners would camp overnight so that when the skinheads arrived, they had nowhere to stand to hand out their tat. Michael Ferrier was a 19-year-old man from Guyana who had moved to Hackney in 1971 to live with his mother and sisters. Early on the 10th of December 1978, Michael and his friends got into a fight with white teenagers in Stoke Newington High Street. Michael was stabbed and went into Stoke Newington police station to get help. From there, he was later taken to St Leonard's Hospital, but by then he was already dead. Mark Sullivan, a 17-year-old street market trader from Kingsland Road, was given a 5-year prison sentence for stabbing Michael. The judge at trial said that Sullivan was not motivated by racism. Michael Ferrer's family and friends believe that the police had taken far too long to call an ambulance and that this needless delay contributed to Michael's death. Stoke Newington police officers were well known locally for violence, law-breaking and racism. So Ali's death was a single incident in a barrage of violence and bigotry, but it also had a lot of historical significance, changing attitudes both inside and outside the community. And today many Bangladeshis say that it was Altab Ali's death that changed them from migrants who had consciously come to London to work and then to go home, into immigrants determined to build and protect their communities, and to do this by engaging with other communities around them and confronting the British establishment. In 1989, the murder scene, St Mary's Park, had a new entrance archway installed, designed as a memorial to Altab Ali and to all victims of racist violence. Then, in 1998, the park was renamed Altab Ali Park. Today, the 4th of May is celebrated in Tower Hamlets as Altab Ali Day, and though racist attacks are fewer, the organisers and community use it to remind those in minority groups to stand up against oppression. Altab Ali Park is more than just a place to remember a brutal racist murder in the 1970s. It's where London Bengalis meet to commemorate International Mother Tongue Day at midnight on the 21st of February every year at the Shahid Minar, which is a replica of the National Monument in Dhaka, Bangladesh. The monument commemorates those killed during the Bengali language movement demonstrations in 1952 in what was then East Pakistan. At the moment that Bangladesh was becoming a nation, a park that now provides a symbol of the nation's struggle and commemorates the wider fight against anti-immigrant racism was standing unloved and derelict. And that is the story of the murder of Altab Ali, and a tiny, tiny, tiny look at the hauntings of Aldgate. I got so absorbed into this story there. I really advise you to have a look. There are some incredible videos on YouTube of people from the community at the time being interviewed and talking about how important it was and what a change it made for them in terms of just not being able to put up with the racism and the attacks anymore. It's just absolutely fascinating. And I'd never heard of it, and I'd lived in London for the best part of 20 years and have loads of friends who live in the area and just never heard of it. And it's definitely something that not just Londoners, but everyone should know about. But it's absolutely brutal. So I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. I always love to hear from you. So do send me an email. It is themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook, where we're The Monday Night Revue. And remember that review is spelled REVUE. And until next time, stay safe, be kind, and always check the back seat before you drive.